right, and welcome to That's Enough Out of You. It is a podcast, and I am your podcast host, and my name is Bill Rader, and with me is Sean Kane. How's it going, Sean?
Pretty good, Billy. Pretty soon we're going to be calling this the Billy Raid Show, buddy. You're like the main host, buddy, you know?
Oh, I am the main host, yeah.
And I'm like what, Ed McMahon over here on the couch, and you're Johnny Carson?
I'll give you a little bit more than Ed McMahon. I think,
Thanks.
You contribute a little bit more than he did to the Tonight Show. But I'm definitely your main host. And we have a special guest with us. This is now her, I believe, third time on the podcast. The author of A Lie Too Big to Fail, The Real History of the Assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, Lisa Pease joins us.
Hi.
Welcome back.
It's good to be back. I love listening to you guys.
Lisa's our favorite guest. Just don't tell Jim D or Rick Otto or any of the other guys, you know?
Well, they wouldn't be guests if it wasn't for Lisa.
That's right.
That's true.
She got them all on our show. All right, so we have quite a bit to talk about today. Sean, you want to kind of kick things off here with our agenda for today's show?
Yeah, let's get right into it, Lisa. The first thing I want to talk about is, the news with RFK Jr. running for president. So you know him.
I know him.
You do. So let's get right into it. Let's talk a little bit about, your relationship with RFK Jr. and what you think of his run, and let's get into it.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting because literally the first time I met him, he invited me to his house. David Talbot had introduced us, and I talked to him by phone a couple of times, and then he had me over for a little lunch. And as I sat there, with him, I said, I really wish you were president. And it never occurred to me he would actually run.
Wow.
But I think I'm certainly not the first and definitely not the last person to have said that to him. So,
Lisa, what impressed you about him that much?
Yeah, well, he's a free and independent, non-binary thinker. And what I mean by that is that binary thinkers are like, if this is good, then that is bad, instead of there might be good and bad in both of these.
Yeah.
Like if I'm a Democrat, all Republicans are bad. Or if I'm a Republican, all Democrats are bad. That's binary thinking.
Yeah.
Whereas independent thinkers think there's some good and bad in both parties. And there are good and bad people in both parties. And both parties are worth listening to. I think that's a healthy attitude. And doesn't mean you have to vote for both parties. I don't recommend that. Pick a side and stick with it. But don't demonize the other side. Don't shut it out. And you'll be surprised at how much even your side gets wrong, whichever side you're on. So I think it's important for people. So Bobby is more independent in that sense. That said, he has been a lifelong Democrat, to my knowledge. I don't know if he's ever voted Republican, but it's crazy that people are like, oh, it was Roger Stone, got him to run. And it's like, no, he's actually been thinking about this evidently for decades, but he wanted to wait till his kids were fully grown and independent and off on their own. And he knows full well he might be risking his life. So his earlier wife, wasn't okay with that. And his wife now wasn't okay with that earlier. But now she's at the point where she's ready to do it too, because it's her life that would be affected as well.
Of course.
And so, but what I also like about him, he's extremely well read. I'm sure people have seen those online videos of him in front of a bank of books. Well, I've been in that room. I actually was looking for a book in that room one time. And there are like thousands of books, and he has read them all. When he brings a book in, he reads it. And, unlike a lot of people, I think buy a book, sits on the shelf, never gets read. But he's very well informed. He's not, I don't want to say, he doesn't spend a lot of time watching TV. He doesn't even really use a computer. He uses a phone. So anything he types, he handwrites. Like he handwrote his books, and he's written a few books, and that's incredible. So I was part of his latest book, not his latest book, his second to last book, American Values, which is the only book about the Kennedy family I would ever recommend because it's factual. He
Yeah.
lived it. He was
Yeah.
there. He could interview family members and he remembers things. And he has wild episodes in there, like riding in the backseat of a cab with their pet sea lion that they kept in the pool for a while.
Oh, wow.
I'm like, okay, rich people problems, the rest of us never have. But in the book at the
Lisa, if we could, because as soon as you hear RFK Jr. on either mainstream media, even some of the progressive media that I listen to or watch, the only thing they say about him is, oh, he's an anti-vaxxer.
Yeah, and that's not true.
Immediately disregarded.
Yeah, and again, that's how they want you to have that binary thinking. It's like,
right.
If he's anti-vax, then he's no good and I can't vote for him. That's what people want you to think.
Right.
But he has a nuanced response there. He's anti-vaccine makers having zero liability for their products. If a vaccine maker kills you, they're not liable. We are, the public. We have to pay those bills. And he doesn't think that's a good business model, and neither do I. And, there's no incentive for them to get it right the first time because the government has their back. Now, I do understand, in crisis times, we have to make some trade-offs, but that should be the subject of more public discussion. And I think there should still be some liability. There should be some motivation for them to get it right.
Sure.
And so he's anti-toxic substances like mercury in vaccines. Believe it or not, the flu vaccine still has thimerosal in it, which is a mercury derivative. Mm-hmm. So, people say, oh, there's no more mercury in vaccines. That's actually not true. And in fact, when I went to the doctor, I was given the choice. Do you want the mercury version or the non-mercury version? So I chose the non-mercury version. So again, the media propaganda is incredibly powerful. And in fact, that was kind of the subject of my talk in Memphis, which I know we're going to get to in a minute, but it's about how we're all victims of mind control to some degree all our lives. Not all of it is bad. We're all programmed to drive on the right side of the road. I think that's a good thing. That kind of programming I'm in favor of. I wish there was more of it in Boston, because who knows what side of the road they're driving on. All right. But, then there's the limit. And like I said, and the CIA, I met a CIA propagandist one time, and he's like, the CIA loves to do word pairings so that when you hear one thing, you instantly think of the other.
Right.
And so it's been Robert Kennedy, anti-vaccine, Robert Kennedy, anti-vaccine. They've put those two things side by side, so you literally can't hear one without thinking of the other. And so I just encourage your audience, please look beyond labels. If you find yourself with an automatic reaction, somebody very powerful put that there, and you should question that especially.
And Lisa, that's no different than the way his uncle was thinking. I mean, JFK was similar to that in his thinking of, where we got to, with the pharmaceuticals and he went around the FDA in a lot of cases, so he wasn't.
I haven't studied that part of JFK. I haven't read about him in big.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of reading on that.
Yeah, I was going to say, but it wouldn't surprise me at all because he was that way with a lot of other businesses where he felt there was price gouging, like the steel industry.
Sure.
He basically called them out in front of the American people and said, price gouging has to stop. And, it was incredible the way he called them out. I've never heard a president do that until, frankly, Biden kind of did that with Big Pharma a couple of years ago after he got elected. And now I think it was just passed in the last week or so. Medicare now has the right to negotiate its own prices with Big Pharma. And that's a first. And now that you say that, I do remember hearing that John Kennedy wanted to do something similar.
Yeah. But, Lisa, the thing is, the way the media has just attacked RFK Jr. is it's really just a disgrace.
Well,
I mean,
and let me say really clearly on this, I believe it started when he first came out and said the CIA killed his father, because that was several years ago, maybe 10 years ago he first said that. And then he was doing the thimerosal lawsuit, so that was a convenient cover to discredit him without going after him for saying the CIA killed his father. So instead, it's like CIA assets in the media, which, by the way, if your audience has not ever read this article, I think it should be mandatory for every American. Go to carlbernstein.com, the same Bernstein of Woodward and Bernstein who broke the Watergate stories, and look at his magazine articles. And the first one there is CIA and the Media, written in Rolling Stone magazine in 1977. And he talks about how at that point in time, ABC, NBC, CBS, the New York Times, LA Times, Washington Post, every major media outlet was controlled by the CIA. It's mandatory for us to understand that dynamic, because then it makes sense that the media is going after Robert Kennedy, because the Kennedys were wildly popular in their day, because they were, how do I want to say, they were a little bit anti-establishmentarian.
Right.
They were anti the establishment of their time. And I didn't realize at the time what a peacemonger JFK really was, because I heard all the Chomsky crap, he was, going to send troops into Vietnam come hell or high water. No, that's simply not true. But he did say a few things that led people to believe that, because he knew he couldn't get it done in his first term, that he would need 2 terms to do it. And he wanted to make sure he got elected a second time so that he could, really shut the Vietnam War effort down. And he was pulling out troops when he was killed. So those are facts.
Right. And of course, Lisa, Chomsky, to me, I put him in the same spot I put Gianni Russo. Like they're it goes in one ear and out the other. Just
Yeah. Unfortunately, leftist friends who aren't very educated, Chomsky's usually as far as they get. It's like it's one step outside the mainstream for them, and that's as far as they dare go. But I actually emailed Chomsky, myself personally for a little while, and he said, I'll only email you if you don't share our emails. And so I didn't. But in the emails, he was making ridiculous arguments like, we can only go by what Kennedy said in public. We can't believe anything his friends said after he died.
Jeez.
And I'm like, no, because I'm going to tell the truth to my friends. I may lie in public, but I'm going to tell the truth to my friends. I'm not going to tell the truth to the whole world and then lie to my friends. That makes no sense.
Right.
So, yeah, anyway.
Yeah, and then just the way the media. Another thing is, Lisa, RFK Jr. talks about, well, like you said, with the CIA killed his uncle and his father, and they say, he's a crazy conspiracy theorist. And then another thing is he's calling for peace in the Ukraine, and all of a sudden, he's labeled pro-Putin.
Right,
like it's always
exactly.
the extreme, and it just drives me crazy.
These are those binary labels.
Yes.
Again, you can't criticize Ukraine and our effort there without being pro-Putin, and that's just wrong. And JFK himself was like the ultimate non-binary president, because at that time you were either with us or against us, as George Bush said in later years. You were either pro-Russia, pro-communist, or you were pro-America. And John Kennedy realized there was this huge area in between where they were just pro their own country, pro-Chile, pro-Guatemala, pro-Iran, pro-Iraq, pro-Cuba, and not necessarily in one of those 2 giant camps.
Right.
But this is a way they control us, by making us have these binary thoughts. Everything's going to be either or, when everything is complex and nuanced.
So let's move on. Is there anything else you want to say on RFK Jr. before we move on to your trip to Memphis?
Just that I was so surprised, but he responded to a text I sent him, recently, and I didn't expect that since he's running for president. I'm like, he's too busy to respond to me, but he did. So I think that's really cool.
Oh, and one thing I wanted to ask, can you tell the story, Lisa, about how you and him bonded over when you told him that
I think that's when I won his trust. Yeah, because in one of our conversations I think it was on the phone before I met him in person. And I said, by the way, I know for a fact that your father did not approve the Castro plots. And he goes, I do too. He's like, I went and interviewed Castro. I talked to a bunch of people about this, but he had never seen the IG report on the Castro assassination plots, where they basically spell it out. They're talking about claims in a newspaper article on one side, and in the other column, it's like true or not true. And, one of the claims was Robert Kennedy approved the Castro assassination plots. The CIA writes, not true. We told him only about the plots that had ended. We didn't tell him anything about the plots that were still going on.
Right.
And at the end of their own report, they say, can CIA claim or imply that we had presidential authority to do this? And they said, not in this case. In other words, the CIA really was acting on its own. And that report was not declassified until late into the 1990s. So that's why it hasn't like hit the mainstream, because when all the history books were written about that, big lies were told that the Kennedys had approved the plots, and that ended up in a lot of books, and then every book cites every book before it, as proof of that. And I actually went through these books and I'm like, who was the original source? Who said this? It was a guy in the CIA named Sam Halpern, who turns out to be a fantastic liar and a former New York Times reporter. These things, again, are not incompatible. Because he worked for the CIA while he was reporting for the Times. And this is why we don't want journalists as CIA assets. It's a sure way not to get the truth.
And that goes to Operation Mockingbird.
Yes. And I do believe, like MK Ultra, there are terms that we throw around as if they're more meaningful than they are. Operation Mockingbird, the only documents I've ever seen on that are very limited. It was a bugging operation against certain journalists. It has come to mean something that didn't really have a name, but that the CIA has been doing since inception. And that's this huge worldwide propaganda machine. We call it Operation Mockingbird, but there was an actual Operation Mockingbird that was a much smaller operation. Within the CIA, they called it Wisner's Wurlitzer, because Frank Wisner was the head of media and propaganda during much of Allen Dulles' time. And he played it like in Oregon. I mean, literally, there would be a news story. And I tell people, when you walk by a newsstand, if all the headlines look different, you're probably getting the truth. If you walk by a newsstand and all the headlines have the same story, it's probably not the truth. Then there's an operation in effect.
And Lisa, that lie about the Castro plots is probably it aggravates me almost as much as that 1960 election garbage.
Right. Which, by the way, Robert Kennedy goes after in his book. He's like, my father was not paying the mob to steal the election for Jack. He's like, my uncle was, my father was, his grandfather wasn't paying them. His father was prosecuting them.
Right.
And so there's no way the mob wanted JFK elected, and no way they would have helped him get elected.
But it's people like Tom Hartman and Lamar Waldron with their, that book, Ultimate Sacrifice, and just a lie spread about the Castro plots. It just drives me crazy.
Yeah. The whole book that you just mentioned, what is the name of it? Legacy of...
The Ultimate Sacrifice?
The Ultimate Sacrifice. Yeah. Sorry, I'm thinking of the other book.
Based on a complete lie.
The Ultimate Sacrifice is incorrect in that they try and make a Kennedy plot to invade Cuba based entirely on contingency documents that the government always prepares. They have contingencies for invading every country.
Yes.
This is what they do. This is how they justify their big salaries and full-time employment. They're always plotting something. Kennedy never approved any kind of invasion of Cuba. No. That was against everything that he stood for. And, to write a whole book about it. And it's funny because in the past, I've looked into Tom Hartman and I found little articles online. For example, he was at some book signing and he mentioned something about having once been a CIA analyst. That is now nowhere to be found online. In his own bio, he used to joke about how he traveled the world so much his friends thought he was CIA. That's not there anymore.
Wow.
It's like little by little, anything that might tie Tom Hartman to the CIA has been completely washed from the internet. However, he does live in Oregon and Washington, D.C. Now, the only people I know who choose to have a place in Washington, D.C. are those who work for the government, because it's not a nice place to live. No. It's a pretty crime-ridden, difficult place. So, and Oregon is like a lovely, perfect, gorgeous hangout for a lefty liberal. So, to me, that adds more credibility that there's still some government tie there. And I think that's why he says what he says. I think that's why other people say what they say. Some of them may even know it's not true. Robert Scheer, I had him corrected in the Los Angeles Times because he wrote an article, suggesting the Keddys had been behind the plots. And I got a letter to the editor printed in response. I actually faxed them the pages from the IG report that backed up what I was saying. So, and then they published the response, and he will still repeat that lie. It's just, they have to. Once you're a CI media asset, every now and then you have to lie. And that's really unfortunate.
And going back to something you said before, Lisa, it is interesting how every so often you hear these buzzwords in the media, and every media outlet has the same phrase or buzzwords or whatever. That's not a coincidence. There's no way.
Right. That's heavily crafted, sometimes by a PR agency. There's a guy, Frank, I forget his last name, but he's a right-wing operative, and he runs a little place here in Santa Monica, not far from where I live. And I was actually signed up to participate in one of his events because he's a right-winger who's very much against taxes and government programs, except his mother personally had Alzheimer's. So he wanted Congress to raise money to fund Alzheimer's research. So it's okay to have taxes if they benefit you personally. I guess that was his point of view.
Yeah.
But as he would ask the audience questions, he would throw out a word like mountain, and people would be like, immigration. And I'm like, how are those two things linked? Whatever caused them all to respond the same way, I'm not listening to that news source. It was really shocking to me.
Yeah, the first time I remember that happening was when W picked his running mate. And of course now I can't think of his name, but
Dan Quayle?
No, W.
Oh, sorry, not that
W.
Yeah, W.
Anyway, when they all said, all of the news stations, no matter what station you would turn to, they all used the same word, gravitas.
Oh, God.
He brought gravitas to the ticket. And I thought, why are people using that same word? Like, that's
your clue.
Weird.
That's your clue. They're going by talking points. Yeah. Issued probably by the White House. And, of course, George W's father had been head of the CIA. So they knew how to propagandize and work the system. And Yeah.
So, Lisa, let's get to your trip down to Memphis.
There was a conference on the assassinations of the 1960s in Memphis, and I wish I hadn't gotten sick with COVID on the plane or at the conference, because it was really interesting. There were a lot of different people there with different points of view. But what was most interesting to me, and the reason I actually agreed to go in person, is I really wanted to see the King Museum. They have the Lorraine Motel has been preserved, and part of it is now a memorial to Dr. King. And what I didn't realize is that half of the museum's on the Lorraine Hotel side, but half the museum is over in the rooming house where James Earl Ray supposedly shot Martin Luther King. And they have added on to it and distorted it, but I was able to ask some questions to find where the original boundaries were. And there were many other rooms that would have been a better shot than balancing on the edge of a bathtub, trying to shoot out a window at this kind of impossible angle. In fact, there was its own sort of, they call it the bushy knoll. There's like a grassy lawn directly across from Dr. King's room where he was staying, and somebody could easily, a sniper lying in, because at the time of the assassination there were a bunch of bushes there that were then cut down literally the next day, altering the crime scene so that no one in their right mind would think a shooter had been there because they'd be too exposed. But of course with the bushes they'd have perfect cover. So that part was super interesting to me. John Newman told me what his talk was going to be about, but I wasn't able to attend. But it touched on some MK Ultra work that touched on the Martin Luther King assassination. And he's actually writing a book on the Martin Luther King assassination. So I'll look forward to that when that comes out. I spoke on a variety of topics, as you saw, because I sent Sean the deck so he could prep for the interview. But so Sean, I'll let you ask questions.
Well, Lisa, there's so many things I want to get into. The one thing though, when we did episode on the Iran hostage crisis, we failed to mention two things that are very important. One, that Richard Helms ended up being ambassador to Iran.
Right.
And number two is there was an attempt on Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter. Could you talk about that attempt? Because I think it's really important, especially the two suspects' names.
Yes, and I wish I had known this when I was writing my book on the Robert Kennedy assassination, because my main thesis and the most controversial, if you will, point in my book is that Sirhan was firing blanks to cover and pull focus from the real shooters. And even other people in the research community is like, that's a bridge too far. I can't believe that. I'm like, oh, but you actually have to look at the evidence, because literally not one bullet from the pantry matched Sirhan's gun. What else could he have been firing? And people saw flames coming out of the gun. He was shooting something, but whatever it wasn't bullets, and none of his shots killed anybody or wounded anybody. And so when I found the Carter plot thing, it was fascinating to me because it was a very similar situation. One guy was going to be firing blanks to pull focus while some riflemen shot Jimmy Carter from a high building window. And at first, when the reason they were caught and that the plot didn't go off is that the guy firing blanks fired in advance. He wanted to like test it to see if it worked. And by doing that, of course, he's firing a gun in a crowd and the police swarmed in and he was pulled away. And then he, unlike Sirhan, he was not hypnotized and he was just telling the police everything. Well, I was just firing blanks and these other guys were supposed to fire the real bullets. And it sounded so crazy and implausible that the press completely dismissed it. But the FBI kept on it and they ended up bringing in a couple of other people and charging them. And, you know, the guy firing blanks, you can't make this up. His name was Raymond Lee Harvey. And then his compatriot was Osvaldo Ruiz. So you've got Raymond Lee Harvey, Osvaldo Ruiz.
Oh, wow.
Talk about a message job.
Exactly. And I think this was a plot designed to fail. I think this was an attempt to scare Jimmy Carter into doing something. And
which would have been, Lisa, that would have been, the timing would have been about getting the Shah into the United States, correct?
That's what I think, because the Shah was very ill. And in January of that year that he was shot, 1979, I think it was David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger and others were pressuring Carter to accept the Shah into our country. But Jimmy Carter had intelligence that the Shah was so hated, if we took him in, there would be retaliation against Americans in Iran. So Jimmy didn't want to do that. Now, the assassination attempt happens in May, and by September, Jimmy Carter changes his mind. So there's kind of 4 months, on either side of that, where, and like I said, this is theory, because maybe they just want him to do something else that we never heard about that he did or didn't do. But if it was the Shah, it kind of makes sense. And then, of course, what happened when Jimmy Carter brought the Shah over? Well, then the Americans were kidnapped and we had the Iran hostage crisis, which gave birth to the show Nightline, because that was originally just a hostage crisis report, but it became so popular they made it a permanent fixture on TV for many years after.
It might be speculation, but if I'm the president of the United States and I'm sitting there and I don't want to let something happen, like letting the Shah into the country, and then there's an attempt on my life, and I'm looking at a report. Well, and I'm looking at a report, and the name Lee Harvey Oswald is staring right out at me with those two suspects. I mean,
I think
too much coincidence for me.
I think it was absolutely to coerce him to do something, and the logical assumption I think would be related to the Shah. But like I said, maybe it was some other operation we never heard about. But and then of course once the hostages were taken, that was the beginning of the end for Jimmy Carter, because then Reagan, and it was really George Bush Sr., the father, George H.W. Bush, who negotiated a deal with the Iranians to keep the hostages until Reagan was elected. And literally moments into his inauguration speech, the hostages were freed. I mean, you don't need to be a conspiracy theorist to see what happened there. But they were called conspiracy theorists. This whole notion of an October surprise has been ridiculed in the press for decades, until a journalist named Robert Perry, a former Newsweek reporter, went and found a bunch of documents that proved absolutely this is exactly what happened, who met with what, where. It's proven.
So Lisa, a couple amazing things in your speech and the slides that you sent me is you talked about Dr. Jolyon West. And you talked about different ties, like of course West ties to Jack Ruby. You talked about a Patty Hearst connection, Heaven's Gate mass suicide, of course Charles Manson. I mean, so many.
And he's a proven, again, admitted CIA hypnotist psychologist. Some of them we suspect, but we know he's CIA. We have files on him.
Right.
You know, there are others, like I said, we can't prove it. Like William Bryan in my book, I strongly suspect he's CIA, but I can't prove it, and I won't pretend that I have.
Right.
But we know Jolly and West is CIA. Yeah, so here he is in the Patty Hearst case. And, for your listeners who may be too young to remember, Patty Hearst was the daughter of William Randolph Hearst, big media mogul. And she was of the, if you will, the hippie generation. And this was towards the end of the 70s. I think it was 1980. I forget what the year was. But there was a strong anti-war in Vietnam movement at that time. And I believe she was sucked into this cult called the Symbionese Liberation Army. There's no country of Symbia, so Symbionese is just a totally fictitious thing, right? And curiously enough, the leader of that cult had a tie to a CIA psychologist named Colin Westbrook, who had been operational in Vietnam for years and part of Operation Phoenix and killing people. And now he's working with this guy, Donald DeFreeze, who's setting up this, the SLA, as they called it. And so they kidnapped this daughter of this rich guy, and they basically mind control her and program her until she's helping them, rob banks. And I think the message was, I think the point of that operation was to the rich elite, you got to shut down this anti-war protest, because your child could be next. Your child might be the next one in jail, turned on by these hippies or whatever. And so that whole thing kind of went down in flames. And that was kind of the end of that protest era, if you will. And so it's very interesting to me that her court, psychologist was a CIA guy, because if it wasn't a CIA guy, she might have been able to tell some CIA secrets about her programming or where she went or what else might have happened there. And so it's funny, in the Clay Shaw trial, in the JFK case, they had what was known as a cleared attorneys panel, the CIA did. And they made sure that in cases of national security interest, only lawyers from their cleared attorneys panel could represent those people so that no national security secrets could leak out. And I speculate, of course, if they had, and we know for a fact they did, a cleared attorneys panel, they probably have a cleared psychologist panel too, especially if somebody's going to be hypnotized and tried to get to remember something. They want to make sure they don't, on tape, in front of others, reveal special secrets. And so that's why it's so interesting that Jolly West was Jack Ruby's hypnotist at one point, and he analyzed him. And the night before West shows up, Ruby goes crazy in his cell. So I actually wonder if there wasn't another hypnotist first, programming Ruby, and then Jolly and West goes in to kind of see what Ruby might say or not say under hypnosis. Because in his own notes, Jolly and West describes his pupils were very dilated. Well, that's a sure sign of hypnosis, and one of the few symptoms people can't fake. You can fake being under hypnosis, but you can't make your eyes dilate without chemicals. Just by yourself, you can't do that. And Ruby didn't have chemicals in his cell. So it's, what I don't know is, did Jolly West program Ruby to do what he did, and say what he said? And was he programmed to kill Oswald? And in fact, I have secret information I've promised not to share. I will only share this much, but there's a tie between Mayhew and Ruby. And I think that's very significant, because in my book, I put Mayhew as the prime driver behind the Robert Kennedy plot on behalf of the CIA. If Mayhew had a strong connection with Ruby, which would make sense because Mayhew was the CIA's mob guy. He was the one in touch with all the different mob contacts. So that would make sense.
And they were also
And
both Chicago guys, correct? Originally
yes,
from Chicago.
yes. So anyway, so and then of course the Heaven's Gate was a cult where all its members like committed mass suicide together. That was here in California. And Jolene West shows up to like represent the few survivors or the family. And I'm like, this guy is everywhere. There's some suspicious CIA type mind control operation going on.
Again, it can't be a coincidence, right?
Exactly. It's like not a coincidence there. In fact, it was Alan Dulles who used to teach recruits. He's like, there are no coincidences.
Yeah, especially with stuff like that. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Lisa, one more link that's personal interest to me is you talked about the DC snipers, because my uncle, who was my mentor, he was out there in that area, and he was actually living in Silver Springs, working for the government in DC at the time. And one of the victims was in Silver Springs, Maryland, pretty close to where he was living. So can you just talk a little bit about that link?
Yeah, because I had a theory, even at the time. I had done a little research on 9/11 for an NBC producer who was, about to write a dramatic series. And I had found all this stuff like the parallel anthrax story, how that was all related. But in real time, I remember as the DC sniper story came up, it's like they're terrorizing Washington on purpose. And the first line when the sniper started was that they were, Muslim terrorists, that they were Al-Qaeda terrorists. That was the original line. That proved not to be true. And they had actually killed a lot of people before they got, not a lot, but they'd killed a few people on their way to DC. But I really think because it's a scientific fact that when people are fearful, they don't make logical decisions. And I really think the point was to keep our legislatures in a state of perpetual panic until they approved the war to Iraq, because there was reporting that there were no weapons of mass destruction there.
Right.
Valerie Plame's husband, an intelligence analyst, had said, look, I was there. There's no WMD there. And so they basically killed him in the media, and her too by default. And so I went back and I looked at the dates of when the snipers were killing. Now, the vote for the Iraq War was October 11, 2002. And the first person killed in DC was killed like a little more than a week earlier on October 2nd. One person was killed and another was wounded. And then the next day, 5 people were killed and 4 within a 2-hour window. And that launched 24-hour coverage of the search for the DC sniper, which, by the way, ended up being 2 people, DC snipers.
Yeah.
All right. October 4th, another person wounded. October 7th, another person wounded. October 9th, killed. October 11th, 9:30 a.m., one was killed literally as they were going to vote. And by now, you have to understand, neighbors and kids of neighbors are getting killed. Everybody knows somebody who's been shot, or it happened in a neighborhood where they know somebody, and they're all terrified, and they do vote to authorize the war in Iraq. And then 3 days later, an FBI operations intelligence analyst was killed. And I can't help but wonder if maybe she was on to this, and so she had to be silenced. All right. So, Lisa, but then wait, before, because this is where it gets really crazy. And then October 22nd, they still hadn't caught the snipers, but they weren't killing anymore, but they hadn't caught them. And so the police chief gets on the air on TV very late at night, like 11:30 at night, and he reads this statement. And it said, "You have indicated that you want us to do and say certain things. You asked us to say, quote, 'We have caught the sniper like a duck in a noose,' close quote. We understand that hearing us say this is important to you." And when I heard that on the air, I'm like, that is a hypnotic trigger if I ever heard one. And this is how they're going to catch the guys. And sure enough, less than 24 hours later at 3 a.m., the snipers were found sleeping in their car.
Wow.
So it's just, whoa. So it really seems like, to me, that was a CIA mind control op, both on the shooters, who I believe were hypnotically programmed, and sent into neighborhoods to randomly shoot people. And of course,
Wow.
they had a cover story, and it was supposedly a guy angry at his ex-wife or whatever,
Right.
which doesn't make any sense. Why kill a bunch of random people because you're upset at your ex-wife? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. But it does make sense if you're trying to scare the government into going to war in Iraq, where a lot of money was at stake, and the vice president was Dick Cheney, right?
Yes,
I
Cheney.
couldn't
Yes.
think of the name earlier. And Dick Cheney
Halliburton.
was what?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right.
A Halliburton. He was
That's
an
right.
investor in
Yeah.
Halliburton, which got all the rebuilding. We broke it, and then we built it back up, and he profited personally from that.
Which
Yeah.
used to be
insane.
Brown and Root. Halliburton used to be Brown and Root,
That's right. That's right.
which made a ton of money in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
So, Bill, what was your question you were going to ask?
My question was, I guess, the correlation between the DC sniper and the vote. But I mean, to me, this would, for me anyway, what I think something like this would do is more to scare people away from like protesting, right? I would think that rather than trying to influence the government to, I mean, the government was going to do what they were going to do. But I mean, if you were planning on protesting, going to war or protesting the vote, something of that nature.
Yeah, you weren't going to be in the streets with the DC sniper on the loose.
Exactly.
That's for sure.
I'll bring up a personal connection. I was there. I was in DC.
Oh, wow.
When this was going on. I didn't know. It was very early on in while this was happening. I had relatives that lived there, and we were actually doing some sightseeing, and we were just going around, looking at all the different sites in DC. I really didn't even know. My dad knew, and my wife knew, and they told me afterwards, because they knew that if I knew that this was going on, I never would have.
You would have gotten the heck out.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh. Did that hurt the trust between you and your wife?
Well, she really wanted to go. She's like, I'm not telling him,
Don't
because
scare
otherwise.
Oh my. Oh, that's
But that's
so sad.
that's what I would think, is it would scare people away from protesting the vote or whatever. But
and scare America on the whole, because again, this was
Sure.
broadcast across the nation into
Of course, it
supporting
was-
the war in
Yeah, it was
Iraq.
huge news everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. So like I said, we were in this like nonstop terror mode from 9/11 to the Iraq war vote. And then, of course, as it turned out, there were no weapons of mass destruction there. And we demolished this country, and we killed more than 1 million people who
Right.
never attacked us and were never going to attack us.
And there was
And-
anthrax scares all the time. I mean,
Yep. And then
couple of
Paul
days.
Wellstone's plane went down right before the vote, and he'd been one of the most vocal anti-Iraq war voices in the Congress. And
Right.
yeah, oh, sad times. That was probably the most upsetting period of my life, to be honest. That's why, to me, Trump is definitely not the worst president, because George W. Bush took us to a war on completely false pretenses
Yeah.
when we knew it was false, and killed a bunch of people, all for oil and profit.
Yeah.
And that's something I feel we all have to atone for.
And Lisa, a couple other interesting tidbits in your slides that you sent me. You had some about David Ferry, who, of course, was a major Garrison suspect, using hypnosis and hypnotizing his students. Was that in the Civil Air Patrol that he was doing
Yes,
that?
according to, well, I assume that's where that meant, because Richard Case Nagel had left a letter that a CIA agent that I met many years later, who had actually tried to commit suicide and failed, and then found me and Jim, and that kind of renewed his faith in the world, and he started sharing some stuff with us. And in that letter, it talked about, I think Nagel called him Harry DeFerry, but that he was hypnotizing Oswald. That was in that letter. In the Warren report, they talked about Ferry and Oswald and Jack Ruby, and that Ferry was doing some sort of hypnosis demonstration at Jack Ruby's club in Dallas. And that's very interesting. They purposely, I believe, misspelled his name like Faire. I mean, yeah, RIE, rather than FERIE, which was the correct name. So anyway, I think they purposely misspelled his name so no one would recognize if they were just like breezing through the records. but when you read it in context, it's very clear. And when Garrison was doing his investigation, he found a lot of links between Clay Shaw, David Ferry, and Jack Ruby, that one of his assistants, and the HSCA later found that of Garrison's assistants, 10 of them had CIA ties. But one of these people just took a bunch of files and disappeared them. And those were some of the files that were disappeared, because that would draw Clay Shaw much closer to the center of the plot and lead right to the CIA's doorstep.
And Lisa,
yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say David Ferry was definitely working with the CIA. He was flying people in and out of Cuba and landing on the beach. He was famous for being able to do that. Not a lot of pilots could do that. So,
but there a name that you mentioned there that's really familiar to me, but I don't believe I ever mentioned it on any of my podcast episodes when I did our work on Oswald. But could you tell our listeners who Richard Case Nagel is? Because that's a fascinating name.
Yes. So Richard Case Nagel believed, how do I want to say, he thought he was working for the CIA, but he might have at some point been working for a different intelligence service, because, how do I want to say, people can approach you and no one ever works for the CIA, right? They always have some cover. But he was assuming that the people he's working for was CIA, but one of them gave him the job to kill Oswald before the assassination of Kennedy. And instead of doing that, he walked into a bank. Now, this was in September, and there's hints that there was a plot to kill Jack Kennedy in Washington, D.C. in September. There had been a plot to kill him that had failed earlier in Chicago. There'd been another plot that never came off in Florida. And so this appears to be yet another plot that failed. I mean, people are like, how could they get so lucky in Dallas? It's like, it was their fourth time. They finally got everything right, quote unquote. Well, but he walked into a bank and fired into the ceiling and sat down and waited to be arrested. And then when arrested, he's like, because I don't want to be in Dallas later, or something like that. I forget exactly what he said. But basically, it's like he didn't want to have to kill Oswald, because I guess he had been told that Oswald was going to be the gunman. And that part of the story I don't believe, because again, there's no physical evidence linking Oswald to that crime, despite years of the CIA trying. And even the FBI is like, there were no fingerprints on the bag that came in with the gun, or the fingerprints didn't match Oswald. So
wasn't it somebody though in the KGB? Because wasn't he working as a double agent? And it was somebody in the KGB that actually,
it was the KGB that wanted to do that, because they thought that would stop the plot. If Oswald wasn't there, he couldn't be the killer or the patsy, basically, which would make sense. And supposedly Nagel had a tape of a guy named Leopoldo and another guy named Angel. And we're never quite sure exactly who these two people were, but he supposedly had the tape and he offered it up to the ARB, the Assassination Records Review Board, which was created in the wake of the film JFK, when people demanded Congress release the records. And so the HSCA went to see him, and he died like the morning before they arrived. It not died, I think was killed is probably the more.
Well, did he fall down the steps or something? It was something like they said he fell down the steps, but something really suspicious. Like,
yeah. And it's funny because Jim DiEugenio and we drove out to that place because the address was listed in the paper. It's like, let's go look. And it was like a little house at the end of a cul-de-sac, and spies like to do that because then you can see who's coming.
Sure.
It's like people always sit with their back to the wall in a restaurant. You don't want to leave yourself exposed. So yeah, his house seemed very spooky and a big iron grill on the door. So I suspect it might have been somebody he knew who killed him, because he would have opened the door for somebody he knew, right?
Right.
And so we don't have that tape, no idea what happened to it, just one of those many pieces of evidence disappeared over the years.
Yeah, it's probably with Alvin Dulles' calendar, maybe somewhere.
Oh my God, yeah. Oh. I talked about that, right, on one of your shows?
Well, we actually had David Talbot talk about it, but I think he did mention it. But he brought your name up. He mentioned you.
I was the one who found it and gave it to David. Yeah.
Right.
So, and that was after John Armstrong alerted me to the fact that these records were online. So credit to John Armstrong.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Lisa, the one thing you're always telling me about, because I get in the habit of always bringing, when you talk mind control, I always mention MK Ultra because that's so
Right.
popular and it's in the people's mind, name. But
Yeah.
you tell me all the time that was only one of many CIA, and not only CIA, but Army intelligence and Navy intelligence, correct? And there were
Right. And it
so
wasn't even
many
the
others.
first mind
Right.
control operation. In fact, I'm going to go back to my slide on that because I'll just read them off to your audience here. If I can find it. What slide number was that?
I forget.
Oh
It
my
was
God.
there was
a
MK
bigger deck
Delta
than I
though,
thought, but I'll
MK
get there.
Search.
I'm going to find it. Yeah, there it is. I went right by it. Okay, so Bluebird was first, and that
Right.
was the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force and the CIA together from 1949 to 1951 did joint mind control experiments. This stuff goes back like 100 years before that. I mean, hypnotism actually goes back several thousand years. I mean, there's talk of animal hypnotism as well as people hypnotism, and Mesmer was very popular in the 1800s because he was able to hypnotize people. So, but what happened then is with a program that followed was called Artichoke. And this was basically the proof of concept. Can a person be made to do something against their will under hypnosis? And every stage hypnotist will say no. And they do that in part for legal reasons, because if they can and you do something bad, they could be liable for it, right? So they have a very vested interest in making sure the public does not realize that, yes, you can be made to do something you wouldn't normally do. It can't happen overtly. You can't tell somebody, go drive your car off a cliff. People aren't going to do that. But if they say, oh, there's a huge pile of gold and no one has claimed it, and if you take a left, it looks like there's no road there, but trust me, as soon as you go a foot down, you'll see the road picks up again. You might get somebody to drive off a cliff. It's crazy how suggestible some people are. There's a scale of 1 to 5, and about 28% of the population falls in each category. At the upper end, you can't be hypnotized at all, no matter what. At the lower end, you can be made, as Alan Dulles even said, it's like putting playing the phonographic records, like recording and playing it back. It's like you can be completely controlled. And so those are the people the CIA is always on the lookout for. So after Artichoke, then that's when the MK series started. And it started with MK Search. It started with MK, I think it was
Delta?
MK Delta was the first one. And then MK Ultra was second. And because I didn't list them in order on my slide. And then MK Search was like the reauthorization of MK Ultra from 1966 to 1972. And that also included Project Dolphin and Project Chickwit. And then there was MK Burn and MK Naomi.
Wow.
It's like the MK Naomi I'm most curious about, because it's like, why such a specific name there? But then I also there's a program called QK Hilltop, which was actually a mind control program related to Manchuria, literally like the Manchurian Candidate. And then there's something called QK Enchant, which the CIA tried to tell us was just a program about covert security approval, because that's the most common phrase that shows up in these documents.
And wasn't Clay Shaw mentioned in that?
Shaw, Howard Hunt,
right.
Robert Mayhew's son, all had clearance for QK Enchant. Now, if Ferry's doing mind control and he's hanging out with Clay Shaw all the time, is Clay Shaw running David Ferry as part of QK Enchant?
Right.
Howard Hunt claimed, Miles Copeland, one of the founding fathers of CIA, with a little bit more conscience than Alan Dulles, strongly believed that Howard Hunt took a hallucinogenic substance and put it on Senator Ed Muskie's steering wheel, because there's a substance where if it gets on your skin, you lose emotional control. And he broke down and cried at a campaign event, and that was the end of his presidential run. And he was considered Nixon's strongest opponent.
Right.
So, is that what that was about? So just because the CIA says, oh, this is what a project means, especially when they give us like a really innocuous thing for something we've been asking about for 50 years, and suddenly they give us an innocuous explanation, I don't buy it. I don't think that's the real thing. I think they said it so there would be some closure. In the same way, Deep Throat, I don't believe for a second it was Mark Felt. Let's put it this
No.
way. I don't believe it was only Mark Felt.
No.
From my reading, I've actually seen CIA documents where guys are bragging about misleading Woodward. And
Right.
so about Watergate and pointing him down paths that took him further away from the CIA.
Sure.
So, and in his first version of the book, All the President's Men, by the way, there was no deep throat. That was kind of a literary device to give it drama and dimension, and that helped it become a film. Because
Right.
without that, it's just a boring paper chase and a bunch of interviews.
Mhm.
That's what gave it like a dramatic through line.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
And we talked about Muskie too, and we talked about what Nixon's hatchet man Singretti did to him when we did episode on Watergate.
Right.
And when we talked about Deep Throat too, that we don't believe Felt was Deep Throat, or at least gave all the information to Bernstein.
Yeah. And I understand now there's some TV show about the Watergate plumbers that makes them all look like bumbling idiots. And it's like, these were not bumbling idiots. These, Jim McCord used to teach classes at CI for years on how to break in and get out safely. But the day before the break-in, he says goodbye to his secretary in a way that makes her think he's never coming back. That's what she told the FBI later. She's like, he was so weird that day. I really thought he was saying goodbye forever because he knew he was going to jail. That was his plan.
And it's not a guy that makes mistakes like the tape on the door.
Exactly. He knew what he was doing. He was trying to draw attention in his own way. So,
right.
What I want to say about the mind control stuff is people think that it ended because there was a government investigation. But when something works and no one goes to jail for it, you got to know they're still doing it. And that was the most shocking thing when I was doing my research is the CIA's kind of own admission in their files that this stuff worked, that they were able to get people to do things against their will, even self-harm things. I mean, there's always been rumors of people being made to kill themselves under hypnosis, stop their own heart from beating. I mean, it's the power of the mind over the body is so much more than most people understand. And if you give that power over to somebody else, oh my gosh, watch out. And, medical hypnosis may be necessary at some point, or hypnosis to stop smoking works for some people, but don't ever let anybody who isn't a medical professional hypnotize you. By the way, James O'Reilly saw a hypnotist. This was new to me as I was researching for my talk. I knew he had seen this guy, I forget the name. It's in my presentation. He actually saw two guys, but one was a name that was familiar that I'd heard many times, Xavier von Koss. And that stuck in my head because I read about it in a Sirhan book, a book about Sirhan, that James O'Reilly had seen this guy. And so I thought that maybe Sirhan had too, since it was in the Sirhan book. I never found any tie that Sirhan visited this guy, but he was a weird guy who went by the name Reverend, even though he wasn't really religious. And that ties into Reverend Jerry Owen in the RFK case.
Yeah,
who
definitely.
Also seemed to be an amateur mind control guy, and that he was just kind of an ordinary con man. But it was this other guy that I'd never heard of, but it's in the HSCA's report and it's in the FBI files. It's this guy, Dr. Mark Freeman, who James O'Reilly saw 6 times. And yesterday, as I was out driving, I realized I was in the neighborhood. I was in Beverly Hills, and I thought I'm going to go see the house and see the office, where James O'Reilly was supposedly hypnotized. And the house is, beautiful mansion, but in the lower part of Beverly Hills, which is actually not in the hills at all. But the office was directly across the street from the old Friars Club where Johnny Roselli,
yeah.
In a card cheating scandal. So I thought, again, what a coincidence that the hypnotist James O'Reilly is seen is directly across the street from where Mayhew and his buddies used to play, because Mayhew used to frequent that club.
Right.
And Mayhew was literally brought into the CIA by the Office of Security guys, who were the guys that ran the mind control experiments at the highest levels in the CIA. So it all starts to tie together.
In, yeah.
And then I have to think, why is it that in America we have so many mass shooters, and in no other country on the planet do they have this problem?
No.
And maybe it's because in no other country on the planet does the CIA have free reign.
Right.
to hypnotize mass numbers of young disenfranchised kids, or old, what do I want to say, old redneck adults.
Disgruntled. Yeah.
Yeah,
Unbelievable. It's
to
really,
go and do these.
Yeah.
And the thing is, they're almost all killed. So we never get to interview them or find out anything about their history. And I've looked
that's
into a
true.
couple of them,
Right.
like the shooter, the Virginia Tech shooter. And sure enough, that just sounded like a mind control op. And after the Aurora shooting, I looked into that guy's background, and what is his name? Holmes, James Holmes. I saw live when he was apprehended on TV, and he was in court, with the newly dyed red hair. And I'm like, okay, he was arrested with dark hair, and now he has red hair. Who dyed his hair? It had to be like a lawyer. So who else has access to dye in prison, right? I mean,
Right.
that whole thing was weird enough as it was, but he honestly looked hypnotized. I've never seen anybody so clearly hypnotized, because again, I've been to a bunch of hypnosis shows, and I see these people before and then I see them after. And one minute they're sitting in the chair wide awake, and the next minute they're asleep under hypnosis. And this guy, it was like he was trying to wake up from hypnosis and couldn't, and trying to pay attention and couldn't. And it wasn't just like, I mean, I've seen my dad, my family, myself, when you're just so tired, it's like hard to keep your eyes open. It didn't look like that. It didn't look like that at all. Yeah.
Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah. There's a little snippet of video online of that, but not enough. When you see the whole unfiltered clip, to me, it's undeniable that guy was in a hypnotic trance. And in fact, they had to medicate him. It took almost a year before they felt he was qualified to stand trial. So if he wasn't qualified to stand trial for a year after the crime, how is he qualified to be tried at all? Why didn't he just go to some insane asylum right away?
Wow.
It's just crazy. So I encourage listeners. I feel like there's so much to uncover, and everybody wants to go into the JFK case. It's like, there's a lot of good research about that case. Please go research other subjects.
Yeah.
Right.
Because there's so much more to history, and it's happening all around us all the time. And these lesser known incidents, there's a woman named Wendy Painting who really looked into the Oklahoma City bombing. And I finally got her book because everybody's been recommending it to me. I haven't read it yet, but maybe after I do, I might recommend her as a guest or not. We'll see what
Well,
I think.
I tell you, Lisa, I one thing you got me into is I've been recently researching on is the John Lennon assassination, because
Yes.
I didn't think there was anything there, and you sent me that link, and ever since you sent me that, it's like, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a guy
So-
named David Whalen who's been looking into this in some depth, and he said he was inspired by my work on the Surian case. So that was cool.
Yeah.
It's like, this is spreading, and he's doing really good research, and he's interviewing the eyewitnesses and the doctors and the nurses, and he's doing what a real investigation should have done.
He
and
sure
he's
is.
convinced the CIA is behind that one, and that Mark David Chapman was also a hypnotized patsy who was on one side when Lennon was shot from the other side. It's just incredible. And I've read that before, but not to the detail that David Whalen is taking it. And he has a book that will be coming out. So again, future guest, I think.
I hope so. He's fascinating. That was a fascinating link.
Yeah, he's got a Substack that people can follow. I think if you search Lennon or whatever, you'll find it. But yeah, pretty interesting stuff.
So, Lisa, once again, we took up a lot of your time. We do appreciate it, though. This was fantastic, and we hope that you would come back.
Yeah.
And because there's so much more that we want to, but this was great. Billy, you got anything else?
Yeah, no, I thank you so much. And Lisa, I was, if we had time, I was going to talk about this today, but we'll definitely have to have you back. I had recently watched on YouTube, there's the feed, the coverage of RFK's speech at the ambassador, and then everything that happened afterwards. And it was just like a continuous feed. There was no cutaway or anything. And I want to get into that. I want to kind of break that down and talk about that with you, because it was so fascinating. It was so interesting just to watch that.
Oh yeah, I've seen different networks feeds, because at one point I was friends with a CNN producer who was really into this, and he posted a lot of that, and he actually sent me a videotape of some of that footage. And then there's a place here in Los Angeles called the Paley Center, where they have old local footage. And one researcher took me there and queued up a certain piece of footage. And honest to God, it looks like another guy is being taken out of the pantry who is not Surian. because I know what Sirhan was wearing, I know how he was dressed, and I know which route they took him out. And he wouldn't have been in that camera shot because they took him out a different door and down the circular staircase. But this guy, there's 4 guys walking, and the guy is bent over, and he's got like a jeans jacket with the collar flipped up, but he has dark curly hair. So it's like, if you saw only that, you would think it might be Sirhan.
Right.
But like I said, Sirhan didn't have a jeans jacket, nor did he exit that way. And it wasn't Michael Wayne, because that's not what he was wearing. So it's like, who is this other guy? Why is he being carefully escorted out? And who are the escorts?
Yeah.
I think that stuff is fascinating.
There was so much just chaos and confusion, and just nobody knew what was going on. Oh my God, it was crazy just watching.
Right. But you probably heard George Green, he's a black man who's like, yeah, the shooter stood on the table.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it couldn't have been more clear. And that's what I say in my book, that a real shooter was on the table next to where Sirhan was. Yeah. And that's why shots appeared to be coming from Sirhan's direction. Right. But that guy was really firing bullets, and Sirhan was not.
Yeah. So when you come back on, we'll talk. We'll break that down, because I'm really fascinated by that. It was just amazing to watch it.
That's cool. Yeah. I'm glad you did. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Well, another fantastic visit with Lisa. Lisa, do you have anything you want to plug before we wrap up?
Oh, just please support Robert Kennedy Jr. for president. Yeah. That's what I want to plug today. But do buy my book. And I'm not trying to make money. If you don't want to buy it, please go to the library and read it. I just want this information in the world. The more people who know how this works, the more we can prevent it from happening again.
Yeah. Right. Or at least recognize it when it's happening, right? Recognize it.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Patterns start to be real obvious.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you both so much.
All right, Lisa. Thank
you, Lisa. This was great.
All right. All right. Well, that's enough out of us. So have a good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.